I'd been sitting there waiting for Dante Moretti, the Italian Mafia boss, for 3 hours. But the man who appeared behind me was someone my past should have made sure was dead and gone. His shadow reflected in my wine glass, and my blood turned to ice. I grabbed a napkin and scribbled 2 words. He's here. 1 second later, the lights flickered. No cameras, no witnesses, no trace. I vanished from the restaurant as if I'd never existed on the very night I was waiting for the Mafia boss. And when the erased memories snapped back, fire, screaming, red gloves, I understood that tonight I wasn't stood up. I was reclaimed. I am Serena Hale. I know that opening is a lot to take in, and it probably sounds like the climax of a movie, or maybe the opening line of a Greek tragedy. But that moment, that vanishing act, was truly just the start of everything falling apart. Or maybe finally falling into the exact, terrifying place it was always meant to be. It had been an excruciatingly long, agonizingly humiliating 3 hours leading up to that final disappearing act. And before we move on to the violence, the abductions, and the deep, cold secrets, I feel like I absolutely need to walk you through every single agonizing minute of the waiting. Because it's the quiet, crushing shame and the cold judgment that night that truly tested the core of the kind of person I was. The silent, steel resilience I had built up from nothing but sheer stubbornness and a fierce sense of dignity. I was a waitress, remember? Not just a waitress in any casual diner, but the kind of girl who was always moving, always working double shifts just to pay for a tiny room barely big enough for a bed. A girl who had no history worth mentioning, and definitely no future anyone in that room cared about. I was the personification of the invisible class, and yet there I was, wearing my best thrift store dress, the only one that looked remotely acceptable under the blinding sparkle of the crystal chandeliers, for a date with a man who could buy and sell the entire block where I lived, the entire city if he felt like it, the kind of man who existed in a completely different dimension of power and untouchable wealth, a man who moved mountains just by thinking about it. The restaurant, Il Fiume, wasn't just fancy. It was a cathedral of polished, dark wood, hushed, secretive voices, and untouchable wealth. The kind of place where a spilled glass of water felt like a federal offense. I was sitting at a prime table, right by the expansive window overlooking the glittering cityscape, completely alone, with a single, exquisitely expensive glass of deep Chianti that Dante had ordered for me hours ago, before he went silent. Before the world seemed to forget my name and remember only my low status. The first hour passed deceptively easily, the calm before the social storm. I told myself he was simply busy, an important man, running late because of unexpected traffic, or some kind of high-stakes business deal that couldn't possibly wait for dinner reservations, trying to anchor my mounting anxiety with entirely rational, completely flimsy excuses. I kept checking my phone, not for a message because Dante didn't text or call when he was coming. He just showed up, like a force of nature, sudden and unavoidable. But just to make sure the time was still moving, that I wasn't trapped in some awkward social vacuum that only existed in my head, I studied the menu, meticulously pretending to deliberate over the appetizers, even though I knew I couldn't possibly eat a single bite alone under that judgmental gaze, and definitely couldn't afford anything on the page, hoping the maitre d' wouldn't notice how often I was refolding and smoothing the linen napkin in my lap. A restless, nervous habit I couldn't control. The soft, classical music that usually felt comforting, designed to soothe the expensive palates of the ultra-rich, now seemed to underscore the profound emptiness of the velvet chair across from me. A slow, elegant symphony dedicated solely to my own mounting embarrassment and vulnerability. I even caught myself adjusting the thin silver bracelet on my wrist, a cheap piece of costume jewelry I'd worn for confidence, turning it back and forth as if the repetitive, small movement could somehow signal the universe that I was still okay. Still holding it together, still believing in the possibility of him. I remember the way the candlelight made the gold embroidery on the heavy drapes shimmer, thinking how much the restaurant itself felt like a stage set for a life I didn't truly deserve to be in. But by the second hour, the quiet assurance I had managed to project began to dissipate, and the air around my table started to feel noticeably thinner. The kind of oppressive silence that only accompanies high-stakes failure, making every breath feel shallow and heavy in my lungs. The looks from the staff, the people I usually worked alongside in the fluorescent-lit back kitchens and shared rushed smoke breaks with, started to change from merely curious to openly pitying, and then quickly devolved into something cold, resentful, and utterly judgmental, as if I had personally insulted their social aspirations by failing so publicly. By bringing their workplace into disrepute. The whispers were the worst, delivered with razor-sharp precision by those who felt trapped in their own service roles, who longed for the life I was failing to secure. They were not loud enough for the other diners to hear over the low hum of conversation and soft jazz, but crystal clear to me, because they were about me, they were about my life, and they were the kind of truth I spent every day fighting to ignore. I could hear Maria, one of the newer girls who was constantly trying to climb the social ladder by dating one of the busboys who drove a nice car, hiss to the sommelier while replacing a centerpiece, her lips barely moving, the sound a soft, venomous S. A man like Moretti would never actually show up for a girl like her. Look at that dress. It's practically vintage and not in a good way. It's a desperate attempt, a fantasy. She's too quiet. Too small for his world, too easily forgotten. She must be desperate to even try, to mistake a single dinner invite for a serious intention, believing she was truly invited to his level. The sting of that word, desperate, hit me right in the chest. A familiar, sharp humiliation of being judged not just for my lack of money or family, but for daring to have ambition or hope that exceeded my station. But I forced my posture to stay rigidly straight, maintaining that quiet dignity that was the only real luxury I possessed, the only thing that couldn't be bought or taken away from me. I picked up the heavy stem of the Chianti glass again, holding it tightly, twirling the deep red liquid slowly, concentrating on the way the light caught the rim and the subtle notes of oak and tannins, using the complexity of the wine as a shield against the rising anxiety, inventing complex tasting notes in my mind, describing the flavor profile to myself just to ground my thoughts. Anything. Absolutely anything. To stop the visible tremor in my hands, anything to keep my eyes from darting to the imposing, heavy oak door one more time, betraying how desperately I wished to see him walk through it and shut everyone up with his mere, overwhelming, undeniable, all-consuming presence. I could feel the heat rising uncontrollably in my neck. The flush of shame I couldn't quite control, but I kept my gaze fixed steady on the glittering cityscape outside the window, pretending the view was the most fascinating, consuming thing in the entire world, focusing on the cold, indifferent geometry of the skyscrapers rather than the geometry of my public failure, which felt like it was shrinking me down to nothing, making me feel like a child again. The third hour was an exhausting, agonizing marathon of subtle, corrosive cruelty, the kind that only happens in places where status is the only currency that matters, and where people measure their own worth by how effectively they can dismiss others and confirm their own privilege. A couple at the next table, regulars named the Whitlocks, who had inherited their money, and their inherent, smug sense of entitlement, finally stood up to leave after a loud, drawn-out meal, their departure feeling like a public event, a final performance for the room. The woman, dripping in so many diamonds that she practically sparkled in the low light, and clearly annoyed that my continued presence was cluttering her perfect dining experience, paused right by my table on her way to the cloakroom, her posture radiating superiority, her chin tilted high. She stopped her meek husband with a firm, manicured grip on his arm, leaning in conspiratorially toward him while shooting me a look that was pure, unfiltered contempt. A look that said I was literally dirt beneath her bespoke shoe, a regrettable stain on the fine carpet. She didn't whisper her judgment. She spoke with a loud, theatrical sigh, projecting her voice with trained precision, and her words, sharp and cutting, sliced right through the ambient noise, echoing like a microphone drop. Who does she think she is, daring to have a date with a mafia boss? The sheer audacity of some people, confusing self-respect with pure, blind ambition, thinking they can bridge that kind of social gap with nothing but cheap fabric and wishful thinking. Honestly, the nerve of these types, thinking they belong in a place like this, when clearly they don't. They simply cannot handle the pressure. Her husband nervously pulled her away, clearly uncomfortable with the public spectacle she was creating, whispering frantically for her to hurry up. But the damage was done. The entire section had heard it. And I felt the collective, cold gaze of every single wealthy patron, people who had everything and still needed to tear someone else down to feel taller, land on my face and burn right through my skin. That's when Mr. Sterling, the restaurant manager, a man who always talked about respect and discretion to his clientele but who measured people only by their credit limit, walked briskly by my table, pointedly not making eye contact with me, refusing even to acknowledge my basic humanity, but muttering just loud enough for the host stand to hear. A judgment that felt utterly final and devastating. 3 hours, absolutely unheard of in this establishment, a complete disgrace to the reservation list, probably got dumped before it even started, a clean break before the commitment was necessary. Just another cautionary tale about reaching above your station. Some people never ever learn their place in the world, and we have to clean up the mess and salvage the table. The way he said salvage the table made me feel like the mess, like I was the piece of debris he was anxious to remove. That judgment, that final, public, crushing dismissal, did it. The polite, strained smile I'd been plastering on my face crumbled completely, and I felt a heavy, crushing wave of disappointment and self-loathing wash over me. A familiar, sinking feeling that reminded me of every time I'd ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told I wasn't good enough to dream bigger than my circumstance, of every moment I had tried to outrun my background. It wasn't about Dante being a mafia boss anymore. It was about the simple, fundamental human decency of showing up, of honoring a promise, of acknowledging my existence as a person who mattered. And in that moment, I felt the bitter, painful truth that maybe all those cruel people were right. Maybe I was just a distraction to him, a simple novelty he forgot about the moment a more pressing engagement came up. Or perhaps he just saw the public embarrassment as a convenient, clean way to end things without a difficult, messy conversation. A way to disappear me without firing a shot, allowing the whispers to do the dirty work. Saving his own reputation. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now, not just from nerves, but from a deep, internal exhaustion. A genuine sense of defeat that went down to my bones, and I let go of the glass, placing my palms flat on the white, unforgiving tablecloth, anchoring myself, taking a deep, ragged breath that I desperately hoped didn't look like a sob, didn't sound like an audible sign of my defeat. I couldn't stay another second, couldn't endure another whisper, couldn't handle another pitying glance. My heart felt like a shriveled, bruised thing in my chest, and I was about to do the only thing I could do. Stand up with the last sliver of my pride intact, nod faintly at the silent, pitying server who was too afraid to approach my table, and walk out of that gilded cage and back to my simple, honest, and suddenly very lonely life, accepting the small, overlooked role they had all assigned me, leaving the wine as a final monument to my failure. The taste of failure was sharper than the bitterest Chianti. Before I go on, before I dive into what happened next, because it gets intense and complicated very quickly, I want to pause. If you're watching this right now, and you've ever felt small, or overlooked, or like you're waiting at a table for someone who just isn't going to show up, I see you. I know that feeling of carrying your dignity when the world is screaming that you have none. That feeling of having to choose grace over throwing a punch. You know, making these videos isn't just about telling my story. It's about connecting with people who've carried that kind of quiet strength through the hard moments. People who chose grace over lashing out. If this story is touching you right now, or if it's reminding you of a time you had to stand tall when everyone was trying to shrink you, could you do me a quick favor? Just take a second, open your phone, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments below that you're here. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your story. And please, please subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep sharing what I've learned, and I would love for you to walk with me through all of it. The heartbreak, the betrayal, and finally the healing. I promise the rest of this story is worth sticking around for, because it's where everything I thought was true got flipped completely upside down, where the waiting finally ended and the real action began. But then, just as I gathered the resolve to push back my chair, my fingers flexing against the tablecloth, preparing for the walk of shame, the overhead light hit the expensive Chianti glass just right, causing a dark, ruby refraction on the polished wood. And instead of seeing my own reflection, the small, tired girl in the too-old dress, defeated, I saw a distortion reflected in the deep curve of the glass behind me. It wasn't Dante, whose presence was always a cold, commanding storm, demanding attention and silencing rooms with his arrival, but something much quieter, much older, and infinitely more menacing. A shape that felt familiar in the way a recurring nightmare is familiar. It was a man, dark and bulky, standing absolutely still in the deep shadow of a pillar near the entrance, positioned perfectly to observe the entire dining room, his head tilted slightly, not looking at me directly, but seeing me in a way that made every cell in my body vibrate with a chilling, raw terror I hadn't felt since I was a child, a primal, bone-deep fear I didn't even know I still possessed, the kind of fear that bypasses logic and goes straight for the ancient part of your brain. His stillness was the most frightening thing. He was a professional hunter who had finally cornered his prey after a long, patient chase, confirming I was never safe, never truly hidden, that I had been found. That was the electric, chilling moment I realized the shame of being stood up was a lie, a carefully constructed smokescreen designed for the public. And the real danger wasn't the humiliation, but the simple, horrifying fact that I was still alive, and now discovered by the one person who shouldn't have been. That was the instant my face drained of all color, the blood rushing out of my cheeks, leaving my skin cold. The same split second I snatched the linen napkin and scrawled the only warning I could think of. A cryptic, desperate final thought sent to an unseen partner, or maybe just the universe itself, confirming that my fate was sealed not by rejection, but by a catastrophic, resurfacing memory. As my fingers lifted from the napkin, a harsh, sudden crack of static noise erupted, the kind of sound a high-voltage system makes when it fails completely, ripping the calm apart, and the lights in the restaurant flickered violently, plunging the whole room into a deep, momentary orchestrated shadow, signaling a controlled, professional takedown designed to leave no trace. The world went dark, and when the lights came back on a second later, the space where I sat was empty, the only evidence of my presence being the untouched wine glass and the scribbled napkin resting beside it, a final, coded message. I remember a dizzying, sickening sense of motion, a powerful disorientation, the overwhelming rush of cold, damp air hitting my face, a heavy canvas bag pulled roughly over my head, and the distant, muffled sounds of surprised shouts from the patrons and the frantic staff, all completely useless against the efficiency and speed of the darkness and the professionals who grabbed me. When I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the pervasive, nauseating smell, a smell that felt like trauma made physical, a scent that crawled deep into my sinuses. It wasn't the clean, sterile scent of a hospital, or the metallic tang of blood that I somehow expected from the violence of the capture, but a deep, earthy scent of ozone, damp concrete, and stale formaldehyde, like an abandoned science classroom from decades ago that had been left to rot and fester, mixed with an industrial machine oil and something faintly chemical. The air was thick, heavy, and tasted faintly metallic. I was lying on a metal gurney, the thin, cracked vinyl mattress offering no comfort, chilling me to the bone, and my wrists and ankles were secured with heavy, cold restraints, thick steel cuffs that bit painfully into my skin, the locking mechanisms heavy and solid. The sheer weight of the metal was immediately oppressive. The low, humming fluorescent lights above me were encased in yellowing, brittle plastic, sputtering slightly, casting long, sterile shadows across what was clearly an old, decommissioned industrial or biological lab, a forgotten place of terrible activity, a bunker beneath the world. The space itself was immense and cavernous, echoing with every tiny sound, filled with broken equipment, dusty beakers, rusted cages, and things that looked vaguely medical but were clearly instruments of cruelty or forgotten experiments. My mind was racing, trying desperately to put the puzzle pieces together. The shadow, the napkin, the flicker, the abduction. But the fear was too thick, too cold, suffocating any logical thought, reducing me to a purely reactive, terrified animal, unable to form a coherent plan. I tried to pull against the cuffs, testing the strength of the restraints with a desperate heave, knowing it was useless but needing to feel the resistance. But they were solid, professionally installed, bolted right to the metal frame, and I knew instantly that my quiet dignity wasn't going to help me here. This was a whole new level of terror, a place where civility and hope died a silent, cold death. That's when Viktor Dragunov stepped out of the deepest shadows, his figure becoming menacingly solid in the oppressive gloom, and the sound of his heavy, expensive dress shoes echoing on the concrete floor was almost worse than the sight of him. The rhythmic steps counting down the time I had left, sounding like a slow, deliberate executioner's tread. It was a rhythmic, calculated sound, the sound of a predator enjoying his own, unhurried, inevitable approach. He was a powerfully built man, Russian, with a face that looked like granite, and eyes that held absolutely nothing but cold, calculating intelligence, a complete lack of human warmth that was terrifyingly absolute. A man who had perfected the art of not caring. I recognized him immediately. Not from the news or any wanted poster, but from a deeply buried, primal place in my mind, a place that screamed enemy, disaster, run now. He smiled, a thin, cruel gesture that didn't even reach his cold eyes, and leaned over the gurney, his face inches from mine, smelling faintly of expensive cologne layered over something acrid and metallic. Maybe sulfur or old oil. The scent of the lab itself clinging to him like a second skin, a professional veneer over rot. "Serena Hale," he said, drawing out my name as if tasting a forgotten memory, emphasizing the Hale as if it were a joke, a label of insignificance, a nobody, a girl who thought she could date the untouchable. "You really thought Dante Moretti loved you? You're just a tool, Serena. A very expensive, very useful tool, engineered for one singular, forgotten purpose. And that purpose is me." He didn't wait for me to respond, didn't seem to care that I was breathing heavily, tears of fear blurring my vision, tracking the movement of his eyes. He just moved to a dirty metal table where a weak, focused lamp cast a circle of yellow light and tossed a thick, worn manila file onto it, the paper hitting the metal with a hollow, shocking thud that resonated with finality, the sound of my life condensed into a single object. The file was mine, the summary of my entire existence laid bare for my enemy to weaponize. My whole life, summarized on bleached, yellowing paper, years of my identity reduced to black and white reports and sterile diagnoses, all the years I spent hiding now revealed. He flipped it open and started narrating. A low, menacing monologue that was specifically designed to break me down completely, to annihilate my sense of self-worth and any remaining hope. He pointed to a photo of me as a young woman, a nervous, quiet 20-year-old with haunted eyes, and then to a series of police reports and medical records from 8 years prior. He told me the horrifying story I didn't know, or had successfully forced myself to forget. That I was once a key witness to a brutal Mafia massacre. Not a chaotic gang war, but an internal purge orchestrated by a traitor within the highest ranks, and that my memories of the event had been systematically erased by someone on the inside, someone who wanted the truth to stay buried forever, regardless of the psychological cost to me. He paced slowly around the gurney, enjoying the naked fear radiating from me, savoring my confusion, and said, with a chilling calmness that felt infinitely more threatening than any shout or threat, "Dante will never come for you, little waitress. Not because he was stood up, but because love was never real. It was merely a temporary distraction, a convenient cover, a way to keep you close until the right moment. You were simply bait, Serena. A perfectly placed, easily disposable chess piece to lure out the person who protected you all those years ago, the one who covered up the mess and who is now, inconveniently, still alive. His words were a physical blow, designed to crush the last flicker of hope and make me believe I was truly worthless. Nothing but a piece of strategically placed evidence to the man I thought cared for me. He wanted me to understand that the humiliation I felt at the restaurant was just the beginning of my insignificance, that Dante's world would drop me without a second thought the moment I became a liability, that my presence there was a cosmic joke at my expense. He wanted to shatter my faith in the only man who had ever shown me kindness in that brutal world. The silence that followed his accusation was heavy, thick, and almost unbearable, punctuated only by the low, sputtering hum of the faulty lights and the shallow sound of my own panic. My throat too tight to even manage a cough, a whimper of protest. I fought the urgent, desperate urge to close my eyes, forcing myself to stare back at him, meeting his granite gaze with a quiet, desperate fire, a stubborn refusal to break, even though my lower lip was trembling uncontrollably, and I could feel tears building behind my eyes, blurring the outlines of the room. I had to show him that even strapped to a table, even with my past being dissected and mocked, I still had agency. I still had a soul he couldn't touch or truly break, even if it was just an illusion, a facade of defiance. But he was relentless, a surgeon of psychological torment, who knew exactly where to press and how to exploit the guilt and confusion. He snapped his fingers, and a single flickering monitor in the corner crackled loudly to life, bathing the entire room in a harsh, cold blue glow that hurt my eyes, forcing me to watch the nightmare of my childhood. What played on the screen was a grainy, horrifying video, clearly old security footage, the kind of cheap, low-resolution surveillance from a broken-down neighborhood or a poorly secured building that was never meant to last. It showed a building engulfed in angry orange flames, smoke billowing thick and black into the night sky. And then the camera panned down to a scene of absolute carnage, a blood-soaked nightmare of bodies and debris. And then, there I was. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, standing absolutely alone in the middle of the destruction, a horrifying stillness around her. Her small dress torn and smeared, her eyes wide, staring directly at the lens with a look of vacant, profound shock. As I watched the child me, fragments of memories started to pierce the massive wall I'd built for 2 decades. The acrid smell of burnt wood and cheap oil, the frantic, panicked shouts of adults, the deep, guttural sound of fear, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. A sound that resonated in my ears now, forcing the past into the present. It wasn't just a fire, it was the annihilation of the only family I had ever known, the horrific purge of an entire wing, and the sheer, overwhelming terror of the little girl on the screen finally broke the dam inside my mind, flooding my present with ancient, agonizing pain and confusion, mixing the past with the now. The little girl on the screen was me, and I was watching her, feeling her terror all over again. A deep, cyclical agony. I could almost taste the fear, sharp and metallic, in the back of my throat, as the past and present collapsed into one moment. Meanwhile, miles away, Dante, operating from his secure, subterranean retreat, had his world tilt not just when I disappeared, but when he received the cryptic, encrypted line that I was waiting for him, knowing that was the sign the trap had sprung, that I was gone. He knew instantly that my vanishing act from Ilfume wasn't a random occurrence or a lover's spat. The first thing he did, not trusting even his most loyal security team yet with this sensitive matter, was personally review the restaurant camera footage, every single frame, hour by hour, his sharp eyes searching for the smallest anomaly. For the moment the continuity broke. He saw me sitting there, poised, alone, and then the lights flicker, and the space where I sat was suddenly empty, the only trace being the untouched wine and the crumpled napkin. He was looking for a break in the video, a static ripple, a momentary distortion of interference, but the footage was terrifyingly perfect. Too clean, too smooth, running seamlessly across the crucial moments, which was the first huge red flag. That's when his security expert, a highly trained man named Enzo, with eyes that missed nothing and a mind that ran like code, pointed out the critical, overlooked error. "Boss, This footage wasn't tampered with tonight, not in the moment of the abduction. The timestamp metadata shows it was edited, meticulously scrubbed clean, and put on a loop 48 hours before the date even happened, preloaded into the restaurant's security system. The abduction was planned in advance to look like a clean, untraceable vanishing act. A deliberate lie orchestrated by someone with immense foresight. Dante's blood ran cold with the realization. The kidnapping wasn't a spontaneous grab. It was a planned professional ambush designed specifically for me, meaning the trap had been set long ago, long before I ever met him, and the date itself was merely the stage for the final, public act of my capture, the moment to reveal me to the world. This was deeper than his current rivals. This was history resurfacing, coming for me and for him, demanding payment for a decades-old crime. The full chilling weight of the situation landed with the recovery of the only item retrieved from the table, sealed in a plastic evidence bag, the napkin. Dante stared at the 2 words I had scrawled. "He's here." The handwriting was undeniably mine, the penmanship desperate but characteristically precise. Dante knew those words weren't meant for him. If I thought he was finally arriving after 3 humiliating hours, I wouldn't have written a warning. I would have stood up to greet him, relief flooding my face. My message was a clear, desperate warning, a final thought sent to an unseen partner, or maybe just the universe itself, confirming that my fate was sealed not by rejection, but by the sight of someone I recognized from my deepest, most terrifying past. Someone I knew meant death, the original enemy. The person I saw, the person who made my blood run cold and caused me to vanish. It wasn't him. It was my nemesis, the person I needed protection from, the one who had finally caught up after years of hiding. It confirmed what the edited footage already implied. I was being watched long before I ever agreed to see Dante, and the whole expensive spectacle of the date had been co-opted and turned into a personal trap that had nothing to do with the Moretti family's current affairs. Dante realized that my fragmented history, the vague, frustrating gaps in my background I'd always deflected with vague smiles, were now the center of a much older, much deadlier conflict. A conflict he hadn't even known existed. A conflict that was about to consume both his life and his carefully built empire. And he knew instantly who the orchestrator had to be, the man everyone thought was dead. The silence from his usual intelligence channels confirmed the depth of the betrayal. This enemy was operating in the shadows, outside of the known system. Dante initiated a massive, covert investigation, pulling every thread on my non-existent past, tracing the few cryptic references in my sealed police and medical records, circumventing every official barrier with illegal but efficient precision. The orphanage, the place mentioned in the ancient files, was his only concrete lead, and he tracked down its original location. A desolate, abandoned place 30 miles outside the city, only to find a desolate, burned-out shell of a building, a place where only weeds grew and the air still smelled faintly of ash and loss, the remnants of a great tragedy. The official records, the ones that had been filed and sealed decades ago, all confirmed the same horrifying story. A catastrophic, accidental fire, an internal building collapse, and every single child, every staff member, every record, tragically gone, the perfect clean sweep of a disaster designed to look like a natural tragedy. Every report concluded that every child died in the flames, a heartbreaking but officially closed case. But Dante was meticulous, a calculating man who trusted paper trails more than he trusted even his closest advisors, knowing lies often hide in plain sight. Deep in the municipal archive, he found an old, dusty internal fire department report, mostly overlooked procedural notes about damage assessment and structural integrity. But within it, there was a small, crucial detail. A forensic photograph taken days after the fire, showing a very small handprint smeared into the dust of an exterior window frame, high up on the wall near a broken pane. The print was too high to belong to a child running out, and too low to belong to an adult lifting a body from the ground. It was the undeniable proof that one child, one terrified, small human being, had been pushed through a high window and escaped the inferno. Someone wanted to ensure one person survived to tell the tale, or perhaps simply to be rescued. That child, he knew with absolute certainty now, was me, the sole survivor, the living witness, the key to the entire operation, the one person who could expose the 2-decade-old deception. Dante realized with a sickening twist in his gut that Victor hadn't abducted me just to pressure the Moretti family with a generic, predictable hostage situation. He wanted to destroy the entire foundation of Dante's world. Victor wanted to dig up exactly what I saw, what I knew but had been forced to forget by the trauma and subsequent treatment. The truth that the erasure had failed to fully suppress. I wasn't a victim of circumstance. I was the sole living, breathing witness to a 20-year-old crime that could unravel the entire, carefully constructed structure of the Mafia world, the truth of which had been buried for too long by a traitor who had successfully faked his own death. Viktor Dragunov, the man believed dead. He started searching through the deepest, most private family archives, hidden within the reinforced stone walls of his grandfather's private library, a place filled with forbidden truths and dangerous secrets only the old boss would know. There, on a dust-covered ancient reel of film, so old it threatened to crumble, Dante found a recording of the old man, the former boss, talking in hushed, worried tones during a time of great upheaval, a time of purges, suspicion, and undeniable betrayal within the ranks. The lighting was poor, the sound crackled and distorted. But Dante heard one line, chilling and prophetic, that solidified everything he now suspected, the final confirmation of his worst fears and highest hopes. If the girl survives, the war will either end or begin. Her knowledge is the key to everything. It wasn't about a treasure or a lost document. It was about the truth I carried. The truth of the real traitor. The one who had orchestrated the massacre 20 years ago. The one who hadn't been exposed. The one whose name was on the tip of my tongue, but locked behind a wall of trauma and fear. The war wasn't over. It had merely been sleeping, waiting for me to be found, waiting for my memory to be unlocked, waiting for the final player to take the stage. For the Moretti name to be cleared, I had to speak the truth. Back in the abandoned lab, Victor wasn't done with his psychological assault. Not while I still had a flicker of resistance left in my eyes. He knew I was teetering on the edge, the conflicting, violent memories of the red gloves and the smell of disinfectant filling the vast, cold space of the lab. He needed to break me completely, to make my truth his weapon, to turn my deepest trauma against the man I loved. He grabbed a piece of thick charcoal and a large sketch pad with a heavy board back, slamming them down on the metal gurney beside me, the noise a painful, sharp jolt that resonated in my ears. "Draw him," he commanded, his voice suddenly sharp, snapping me out of the haze of overlapping terror. "Draw the man who killed your family. Draw the face you couldn't forget. Use the details you see when you hear the music, the face behind the gloves, the one who committed the atrocity, the one you saw clearly." My hand was still shaking violently, but something compelled me to obey, the desperate, overwhelming need to exorcise the image, to force the truth out into the light, even if it was just a fragile, dark charcoal drawing. The memories were overwhelming now. The heavy, distinct red gloves, the sickeningly sweet, burnt smell of sugar mixed with the institutional disinfectant, the deafening roar of the fire, and the face, always the face, framed by the smoke and the chaos, etched into my subconscious. I focused on the shape of the features, the stern jawline, the deep-set, weary eyes, the severity of the expression, and I sketched quickly, desperately, the charcoal blackening my trembling fingers, leaving dark, irreversible streaks on my skin. When I finished, I stared at the resulting portrait of the killer. A man with kind, sorrowful eyes and a deeply etched frown. A face I felt I knew deeply. A face that haunted my peripheral vision. And a part of me felt a twisted sense of nauseating release, as if I had finally purged the visual demon. Victor snatched the drawing away, his eyes scanning the lines of the sketch with furious concentration, a triumphant, malicious glint appearing in his cold gaze. And then he let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed painfully and cruelly in the silent lab, a sound of absolute, hateful victory. It wasn't a laugh of genuine joy, but a cruel, satisfied sneer of perfect manipulation, of a plan executed flawlessly. Perfect, he spat, holding the drawing up triumphantly as if it were a championship trophy, a prize earned through my agony and fear. You just drew Giovanni Moretti, Dante Moretti's own foster father, the man who raised him, the man he worships, the man he believes was a martyr, the man you just identified as the killer, sealing his son's fate before the entire world. The floor dropped out from beneath me again, the sense of betrayal overwhelming, a double cross that spanned decades. The man I had drawn, the man with the red gloves who I now realized was at the crime scene, was the man who had raised Dante, the man Dante respected and loved above all others. Victor immediately set up a live feed, an encrypted high-bandwidth stream directed straight to the underground dark web channels watched by the entire International Mafia Council, making the revelation instant and irreversible, guaranteeing maximum damage to Dante's reputation and power. He held up the sketch, he held up the file, and he narrated the scene with chilling, flawless conviction, making it seem as though I, the sole, authentic survivor, had just revealed that Dante Moretti was the son of a traitor, a man responsible for the purge 20 years ago, and that Dante was now protecting the enemy, actively hiding the truth. It was a tactical, devastating blow, a public and undeniable act of character assassination designed to not just defeat Dante in battle, but to crush him completely, leaving him ostracized, defenseless, and exiled from his own world, shattering his very identity and all he stood for, with my words as the weapon. But in that moment of absolute paralyzing despair, staring at the charcoal drawing of Giovanni's face, the final, crucial piece of the puzzle slammed into place with a terrifying force, like a vault door clicking shut on the truth, sealing away the lie forever, replacing the trauma with understanding and a burning, protective rage. The red gloves, they weren't the gloves of a killer or an executioner. They were the heavy-duty, protective, chemical-resistant firefighting gloves I had seen on the one man who desperately tried to save people from the flames, the only person who came through the blaze alive, stained with both soot and blood, but not the blood of the innocent. And the face I drew, Giovanni Moretti's face, wasn't a killer's face. It was the face of a man in profound anguish, a man making a terrifying, impossible choice, a choice between saving the orphan and dying alongside the traitor, a choice that forced his hand into violence to save the innocent. I hadn't seen Giovanni killing the orphans. I had seen Giovanni killing Victor to save us, to end the massacre, to stop the purge, a heroic sacrifice that cost him his life and reputation, a truth Dante never knew. The man standing over me now, mocking me with my own trauma, the man who claimed I was just bait, was the original traitor, the one whose death had been universally accepted by the council for 2 decades, allowing him to operate in the shadows, orchestrating his final revenge. The trauma I'd experienced wasn't witnessing a murder. It was witnessing a man sacrificing his honor and his life to end a devastating, internal war. Shocked to my core, my entire body convulsed with the force of the memory, and I looked at Victor, seeing past the granite face to the cold, calculating monster beneath, realizing he hadn't just been torturing me for information. He had been torturing me to confirm his own faked death and subsequent all-consuming revenge plot against the Moretti family, using me as the final, devastating proof that would destroy Dante. A powerful, electric surge of adrenaline hit me, fueled by 20 years of erased memory and a sudden, undeniable clarity that was stronger than any sedative, overriding all fear. Everything Dante believed, everything the council believed about that day, was a monstrous lie perpetrated by the man standing in front of me, a deep-seated truth I alone possessed, and I knew I had to expose it right then, before he could kill me and bury it again. I looked straight at the tiny red light of the hacked camera he was streaming from, ignoring Victor completely, who was busy preening for the camera, already proclaiming victory. And I screamed the truth, my voice raw and loud, a final, desperate burst of energy that echoed through the empty lab and across the world feed. He's the traitor, not the man with the red gloves. Giovanni saved me. He shot you. You faked your death. You are Victor Dragunov. Dante, watching the feed from his dimly lit, now chaotic office, froze completely, every muscle in his body seizing up as his world reoriented itself, around a completely new, terrifying truth. The composure he'd held onto through 2 days of searching and strategizing shattered instantly, because the woman he cared for, the one he thought was purely innocent and knew nothing, had just accused the untouchable ghost of the man who started the war, the man the council believed was long dead, and implicated his father's actions in a heroic, tragic light, clearing the Moretti name. His entire belief system, built on the foundations of his foster father's perceived betrayal and the subsequent family shame, began to shatter. As Victor raged, screaming at the camera, losing his control for the first time, sputtering that I was lying, that I was broken, that I was a tool of the Moretti family, trying desperately to regain the upper hand. I looked down at the restraints, feeling the slight give I had created. Remembering the time I'd spent working in a tiny, dusty old antique shop, the hours I'd spent sorting through old costume jewelry and learning to open tricky old lockboxes with delicate tools, I calmly, quietly brought my hands together, pressing the heavy steel cuffs against the intricate, coiled metal of the hairpin that I had hidden in my bun for good luck that night. A little habit I had never broken. A secret weapon in plain sight, slowly, meticulously, forcing my trembling fingers to be still and precise despite the adrenaline. I started working the delicate metal wire into the tiny, complex locking mechanism, focusing only on the faint click, click, click of the tiny brass tumblers falling into place, a sound only I could hear above the madness and the frantic shouts of my enemy. The chaos that followed my outburst on the streamed feed was immediate and deafening, a direct, explosive hit to the hierarchy of the Mafia world that had been built on Victor's monstrous 20-year lie. Victor knew he had to eliminate me instantly to silence the truth before the council could react to the stunning revelation. But before he could even move, the pressure on Dante from the council was unbearable. The fallout from the traitor's son revelation and the counter-accusations spreading like wildfire, threatening to engulf his entire operation. Victor gloated, leaning into the camera, a final, cold smirk plastered on his face, trying to assert final dominance over the situation. If Moretti tries to save you now, the entire Mafia Council will execute him for protecting the enemy, for interfering with the justice of the dead. She's a liability, Dante. Choose. Your whore or your life, your worthless waitress or your empire. Make your final, pitiful choice. I could see the panic and thinly veiled relief in the eyes of some of Dante's oldest allies, who were also monitoring the feed, seeing a chance to seize power or avoid taint. Their voices, usually so strong and supportive, were now cold and unforgiving, desperate to save their own skins and their fortunes. Don't save her, Dante. She's just a waitress. She means nothing to the family. Cut your losses now, prove your loyalty. You can't sacrifice the empire, the family's legacy, for a girl with no name and a contaminated past that will stain us all. Dante was backed into a corner where every single choice meant devastating loss. Lose me. He loses his heart, the truth, and the chance for peace. Save me. He loses his empire, his family, and his life, becoming an outcast himself. The underground news channels, the ones that fed the gossip and the political maneuvering of that dangerous world, started running stories that Dante had stood me up at Il Fiume because he was ashamed of me, that he had known about my shady witness past all along and had simply been using me as a temporary distraction or a temporary mistress, testing the loyalty of his men. They claimed he had cut me loose the moment the heat intensified, proving his inherently cold, calculating nature and his ultimate loyalty to power, not love, that I was disposable. Dante heard it all, the judgment, the betrayal, and the rumors spreading like a poison designed to isolate and paralyze him, painting him as a coward and a liar. But he stayed silent. He never denied it, never tried to defend himself or me on the channels, knowing that any public defense would be traced and exploited. Putting a target on my back, his silence was the final, crushing blow that made everyone believe he had truly abandoned me, the final humiliation that made the world believe I was nothing but disposable bait, a forgotten date tossed aside for political expediency. But I watched his face in the final, grainy frames of his video feed before he abruptly cut it, and I saw something deep and dangerous flash in his eyes, not defeat, but a furious, contained plan, a calculated risk that put my life above everything else, including his crown, his legacy, and his safety. The price of my freedom was his public exile. That silence, that public, humiliating abandonment, was Dante's carefully constructed shield, the ultimate misdirection to keep his enemies guessing and his allies at bay. He knew the Council and Victor were watching his every move, anticipating a predictable, grand, military-style rescue that they could easily track, intercept, and shut down, ending me and incriminating him irrevocably. Instead, Dante did the unthinkable, the action only a leader truly unconcerned with power would take. He secretly began erasing his name from the deepest layers of the Mafia systems, scrubbing his financial footprints, his encrypted communication logs, and his official status so the Council couldn't trace or control his movements, essentially becoming a ghost in his own empire, a rogue element operating completely off the grid. He knew one leak, one soldier, one wrong decision, and I would be dead before he crossed the state line. He brought no soldiers, no convoy, just himself and the ghost of an old identity. A forgotten alias that no one had used in 20 years. An identity that predated the war and its internal politics. A simple, untraceable man, he slipped across the heavily guarded border into Russian territory, alone, undetected, heading straight for the coordinates of Victor's hidden lab, a fortress that should have been impossible to penetrate without an army. He moved like a shadow, shedding every mark of the boss, becoming simply a man on a desperate, solitary mission to save the woman he refused to publicly acknowledge but would die for privately. A single point of focused, lethal intention moving through the night. I was still working the last pin in the shackle, the steel finally clicking free on my left wrist, my heart pounding a violent, hopeful rhythm against my ribs when a new screen flickered to life in the lab. A small, dedicated surveillance monitor that Victor had foolishly used to monitor the external perimeter. It was an exterior view, a wide, sweeping shot of a desolate, snow-covered industrial landscape, the very picture of isolation and frozen silence. And then, a solitary figure emerged, moving with silent efficiency through the skeletal, snow-dusted trees. It was Dante. He was wearing an old, nondescript heavy coat, looking more like a mountain climber or a fugitive than a Mafia boss, his face obscured by the low light and the shadow of his hood. But I knew the way he moved. The cold, lethal economy of his stride. The sheer, dangerous intent in every step. The way his shoulders carried the weight of his decision. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt the tears finally come, hot and fast. Not tears of fear now, but of pure, crushing realization and gratitude that fractured my composure. A profound release of the tension of the last 3 days. I saw the insanity of his choice, the absolute self-destruction of his path, and my throat tightened with a profound sense of protective terror. "You're insane," I whispered, a hoarse, ragged sound as I stared at the man who had just traded his entire life, his powerful kingdom, for mine. He must have heard me, or maybe he knew I was watching, because he stopped, right at the heavily fortified entrance, looked directly at the camera, and his voice, transmitted through a low-frequency feed that only I could hear, was soft, steady, and utterly devoted, cutting through the years of manipulation and doubt. "I didn't show up that night," he said, and the words sliced through the lies I had been forced to believe like a surgeon's scalpel, revealing the clean truth underneath. "I didn't show up that night because I knew someone was waiting to take you. I didn't abandon you. I stepped back so they would take the bait, think they won, and I could come for you alone, outside their notice, outside their network, the way no one would ever expect." His voice was a lifeline, a final, undeniable truth that cut through all the manipulation and the shame I had endured, healing the wounds of 3 agonizing hours in an instant. He hadn't stood me up. He had kept the trap from snapping shut on him, knowing that if he went to the restaurant, the outcome would have been immediate. A quick, clean double kill, silencing us both and hiding Victor's secret forever. He chose to disappear, to look like a coward and a villain in the eyes of his peers, just to buy the time he needed to come for me alone, outside of the traceable, controlling systems. That quiet admission was everything. It washed away the humiliation, the whispers, the snide remarks of the wealthy woman, and the manager's cold dismissal. It told me I had never been small, or disposable, or a pawn. I had been, and still was, the center of his world. The irreplaceable core of the 20-year-old war he hadn't even known he was fighting until a few hours ago. The key to his family's honor. My hands worked faster on the hairpin, renewed with a singular, fierce purpose. The final tumbler in the lock finally clicking into place with a definitive, metallic sound that signaled my freedom. And I yanked my right hand free just as the lab door hissed open. Victor, enraged at the intrusion and the sheer audacity of Dante's solitary approach and the collapse of his trap, moved with terrifying, panicked speed, grabbing me just as I sat up on the gurney. He knew the council would soon realize my truth and his lie, and that his window was closing fast. He grabbed a heavy handgun from the metal table, a long, black weapon that looked too large for his hand, and slammed it into my now free, but still trembling palm, forcing my fingers around the cold steel grip. The cold weight of the steel was shocking, an undeniable extension of his control, and his breath was hot and ragged in my ear. "Kill him!" he hissed, his face twisted with pure hatred and frustration, his voice cracking with desperation. "Kill him and you live, Serena. You get to decide the fate of your hero, and you get to finish what Giovanni started by saving yourself. Show him your true loyalty, your loyalty to survival. Put the bullet in his head." My hands were shaking again, but this time, it wasn't just fear. It was a terrifying, volatile cocktail of memory, emotion, and adrenaline, the weight of the gun heavy with impossible responsibility. I could see Dante in the corner of my vision, having breached the first line of defense, moving toward the main lab door with the calm, terrifying efficiency of a predator who had shed his skin. All the memories, the fire, the red gloves, the betrayal, the humiliation, they all collided in my head. A massive, painful pressure that made it hard to breathe or think, reducing the universe to the space between my eyes and the gun sight. I lifted the gun, the muzzle of the weapon unsteady, pointing it directly at the approaching figure in the doorway, forcing myself to look at him, to acknowledge the choice. Dante stopped, right in the center of the entrance, framed in the dusty light, his hands completely empty, open and defenseless, the epitome of sacrifice waiting for my action. He didn't flinch, didn't try to appeal to my emotions, just stood there waiting for the choice. His voice, still low, still steady, was meant only for me, cutting through the heavy silence of the lab and straight into my heart, offering me the only path to true freedom. "Shoot me," he commanded, his eyes locked on mine with a profound, terrifying trust, a look that said, "I trust your strength more than I trust my own plan." "Don't let him control you, Serena. You are not his tool. You are not a victim. Make your own end. End this now." He was giving me the choice, the ultimate, impossible choice, telling me that his life was less important than my own absolute freedom from manipulation, that he would rather die by my hand than see me live another moment under Victor's evil command. Victor roared, a sound of pure, frustrated madness. "You won't save her, Moretti. You don't love her. You care about your empire, and she's already ruined it. You failed to protect her, and you failed to save yourself." I looked at the gun, I looked at Dante, and I saw the honest, earned respect in his eyes, the understanding that went deeper than any words of love, the absolute, undeniable respect for the choice I held. I looked at Victor, whose monstrous lie had destroyed my childhood and almost ended my life. Then, with a gasp that tore from my chest, choking on the tears that finally broke free, I slowly, deliberately, lowered the weapon, dropping my hand to my side, refusing his final command, choosing my freedom and my own destiny. Victor didn't hesitate. He couldn't let Dante live now, not after all the chaos. He wasn't aiming for me. He wanted the emotional, crushing spectacle of destroying the one thing Dante loved, and the man's refusal to allow me to kill him was the final, unforgivable insult to Victor's ego. He pulled the secondary trigger he held, the one aimed at Dante, and the deafening, sharp roar of the shot echoed through the lab, the sound tearing through the concrete space. Dante dropped instantly, falling like a broken doll into the doorway, the sound of his body hitting the concrete floor a horrifying, final punctuation mark that seemed to silence the world. Victor spun back toward me, a look of triumphant, maniacal victory on his face, believing he had won the war, believing he was now untouchable. But that second of distraction, that single moment of gloating, was all I needed. My hands were finally, completely free, the hairpin falling to the ground with a tiny metallic tink, a sound lost beneath the deafening roar of the gunshot. The trauma, the fear, the humiliation, the 20 years of stolen life, it all coalesced into a point of sudden, calm, cold rage, a focused energy I had never known. While Victor was savoring his fleeting victory, I spun, twisting my body, wrestling the heavy gun from his surprised, weak grip, leveraging my body weight and the momentum of the twist with a strength born of pure necessity, a strength that came from realizing the truth. I didn't think about it, didn't weigh the moral cost, didn't allow myself a moment of doubt. I didn't hesitate. I raised the heavy weapon, pointed it directly at the man who had stolen my life and tried to steal my future, the real traitor who had caused the massacre, and pulled the trigger with a devastating finality that ended 20 years of suffering and lies. The gunshot was just as loud, just as final, but this time, the world corrected itself, and the truth stood victorious, undeniable. Viktor Dragunov fell, his expression frozen in shocked disbelief and betrayal, ending a 20-year war with a sound that felt both terrifying and deeply, profoundly quiet, the only sound left being the frantic, ragged rattle of my own breath in the sudden silence. "I remember everything now," I said, my voice shaking but clear, the words echoing in the sudden silence as I finally claimed my past and my power. "And I'm done being afraid of you. My life is mine. Your war is over." Dante staggered, pulling himself up onto one elbow, and I could see the dark stain spreading on his coat. But he was alive, grazed, and wearing a thin, custom-fitted vest beneath his coat. A calculation for the possibility of this exact, terrible moment. A vest he didn't tell me about to ensure my choice was genuine. He looked at Victor's still body, then straight at me, his eyes full of something that wasn't shock, but a deep, powerful acceptance and pride. A shared understanding of the horrific things we had both done to survive and protect the truth. He stood up slowly, walked the final steps across the concrete floor, ignoring his injury, and gathered me into his arms, holding me tightly, smelling of gunpowder and expensive cologne, a scent that finally felt like the only safe harbor in a dangerous, uncertain world. He pulled back slightly, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that spoke volumes, his voice a low, rough whisper against my hair. "That night, you weren't left behind. You were taken from me, and I will never let that happen again. You and I, we start again, knowing the truth. You've been through this. You've been unseen. But you were never small. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.